From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Kyle, Kevin McCarthy poised to be Speaker if Republicans hold the House, or maybe not. He may face a challenge this week. Story has it Andy Biggs of Arizona may challenge him. How precarious is Mr. McCarthy's hold?
Well, the Biggs bid, I think, is a effort to have a not McCarthy on the ballot and a bit of a protest vote. But the problem is, if not McCarthy, who? It's not clear who else would be able to get a majority of the House and only lose one Republican or two Republicans if the majority the Republicans hold in the House is really that small. And the other thing that I find so fascinating about this is that McCarthy is no one's idea of an ideologue. And so he's a deal maker. You know, there's no ideological objection to him. Maybe it's that he's not a true conservative or not conservative enough for some of the Freedom Caucus guys. But he does have the support of Jim Jordan, the prominent member of the Freedom Caucus. Jim Jordan said recently that, you know, the coach that gets you to the Super Bowl, he gets to coach in the Super Bowl. Even if you win, you know, the division championship in overtime, you still won. You still got to the Super Bowl. And so it's hard for me to see a real alternative here. And since McCarthy is such a deal maker, there might be some concessions he can make, votes on certain priorities or on committee assignments, empowering committees the way some of the backbenchers have wanted. But the real problem is for the anti-McCarthy caucus is they don't seem to have another candidate who has the broad support you would really need to beat him.
Yeah, Kim, you follow this closely. What do the potential challengers to McCarthy want?
Yeah, as Kyle alluded to, this is more about what happens the day after elections. They're trying to negotiate some changes to the internal Republican House rules, as it were, because they're going to have an election on Tuesday, and then the next day they vote on those rules. And this potential challenge is basically a way of trying to wangle out of McCarthy some changes that the Freedom Caucus, the conservatives, want, that they feel will give them more power in how the caucus is managed. In particular, a couple of the things that they're demanding. They would like the members to elect their committee chairs rather than have McCarthy's steering committee put forward who's going to run each committee. They'd like more of a say in who sits on the Rules Committee, which has up to now always been very much owned by the Speaker of the House, because that is the organization that decides what's going to the floor and how it gets there. They'd like some more freedom in terms of what amendments can be offered to legislation. They want, for instance, to say that there can be no more omnibus spending bills, by the way, one I agree with. But this is designed to try to get him to say, okay, yes, I'll do some of this and cede you more power in return for getting to 218. Look, Andy Biggs is not going to become Speaker. He doesn't have the votes to do that. But it would be a black eye to McCarthy if he said no to these demands and then he couldn't get to 218 on the first round. So that's their game. I kind of disagree with it a lot because I think if you're going to challenge him, stand up, air the disagreements and debates, move on. This is a little bit more taking advantage of the fact that he doesn't have a very big margin if he's going to win and trying to cede power that way.
Right. So let's compare here. Nancy Pelosi had this last Congress, a 5 or 6 seat majority for most of the time, depending on vacancies and whatnot. And yet the Democratic caucus remained remarkably coherent and unified. And that's why they were able to get as much as they wanted done. Now, the Progressive Caucus did try to hold the Democrats hostage, the majority hostage for a while in competition with Joe Manchin in the Senate. But in the end, when it really counted, they really did all sign up and vote for that agenda. And they succeeded. Now, let's say that McCarthy has a 2 or 3 seat majority. That's more precarious. But it's all the more reason that if you're the Republicans who want to, number one, put a check on the Biden agenda, number two, be able to maybe get some things done. And certainly in order to do that, push your agenda, however modest it may be, have control over the House floor. And if the Freedom Caucus on the one hand and some of the moderates on the other are going to consistently hold the majority hostage, the party is going to lose control of the floor, and the Republicans are going to be steamrolled and look like they cannot govern. So you would think, okay, let's have the debate here for the Speaker of the House, your leadership of the Republicans. The formal Speaker vote is in January. But let's say You have this debate now, fine. Elect whoever you want as your leader to put forward as speaker. And then you have to support that person. Because if you don't, you're going to hand the leverage to the Democrats. And I don't know if the Republicans are there. Andy Biggs has already said he may not vote for McCarthy for speaker, no matter what the outcome is in this vote for GOP leader. You need 218. What are they going to do? Give the leverage to Nancy Pelosi or somebody else, Kyle?
Yeah, I heard one scenario floated that maybe a handful of Republicans could get together with Democrats and elect some sort of moderate as the speaker, but it gets a little far-fetched. And to your point about sticking together, I agree that Nancy Pelosi, I mean, one difference is that she is the speaker. She has a long history of being speaker and knows how to use that leverage, whereas McCarthy is trying to get the job for the first time. But it is certainly true that Democrats have held together with a very narrow majority in the past 2 years. And in similar situations with even larger majorities, Republicans seem to always find a way to shoot themselves in the foot. And, you know, I get that some people in these conservative districts don't want to vote for the government funding bill or the bill that raises the debt ceiling, but then you end up with a government shutdown. And in the past, that has never seemed to redound to Republicans' benefit. They seem to end up doing it anyway and getting the political blowback of the government shutdown. Or you can go back even further to the Ted Cruz argument that somehow Republican Congress can pass a bill to defund Obamacare and President Obama is going to sign it. And I fear that a lot of this has the whiff of political arguments you want to make to your base, to your fundraising campaign. Put it in an email how much you're fighting for the cause, but you're really creating problems for the party and the political agenda that you want to move forward.
Well, okay, it's going to be messy, very messy. I suspect McCarthy will win, but whether he can govern after winning the Republican leadership race is another question. All right, let's turn to the Senate, and there's some leadership challenges there. Before the Republicans, Chuck Schumer, of course, for the Democrats will continue. No doubts there. No doubt with the gratitude of his conference. But let's listen to Joe Biden talk about the difference between 50 and 51 votes in the Senate.
It's always better at 51 because we're in a situation where you don't have to have an even makeup of the committees. And so that's why it's important, mostly. But it's just simply better. The bigger the numbers, the better.
That is important leverage, Kim, particularly on issues like taxes and spending and key things that could potentially be significant as the next 2 years play out in the Senate. What about the challenge to Mitch McConnell? There's nobody right now who's running against him. Rick Scott, the Florida senator, is thinking about it, but he ran the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee. To borrow Jim Jordan's metaphor, he didn't lead them to the Super Bowl this year. So what is his claim to be the conquering hero, Julius Caesar from Victorious in Gaul, does not play out? Is it a serious challenge to McConnell?
Yeah, and before I jump to McConnell, just one, I think, important point to be said about what it means that Democrats have retained the Senate. If we do end up in a scenario in which Republicans are running the House, that argues that there will be some level of gridlock in Washington in terms of legislation. I would say that would be a good thing. But what it does mean is that Chuck Schumer now has been freed up to do what Mitch McConnell did from 2018 to 2020 when there was divided governance between the Senate and the House, which is to focus on passing Joe Biden's nominees for the federal bench in particular. So the Senate's going to become a big judge nominating and judge signing off chamber. In terms of Mitch McConnell, yeah, there are rumors that Rick Scott would like to challenge him potentially, and that he'd been planning to do that all through this campaign. Rumors that he'd even come up with like a little video that would potentially highlight his skills and reasons for being elected if he went up against McConnell. You now have a number of, I would say, the conservative caucus in the Senate demanding that this election be pushed off until after December 6th, presumably because they know that there isn't really any organized effort to oust McConnell, but that if this were delayed, there might be time for a challenger to get something together. McConnell is obviously wary of that and is pushing for the election to continue happening this week. I think that's right. The argument that if Herschel Walker were to win in Georgia, he would somehow change the outcome of this. Rick Scott knows that he doesn't doesn't have the ability to win that kind of race. And it's sort of the same dynamic in my mind as in the House. If you're really going to do it, then stand up, make the argument for why you're better, hash it out openly, have the vote. But all the kind of maneuvering, it's not healthy for the party. And I just think you ought to be brave enough to kind of have the courage of your convictions if you're going to complain rather than leak to the press.
Yeah, I don't see any other alternative here emerging. I mean, there may be in the secret ballot, 15, 20 votes. I think probably 10, 15 max against McConnell. And the argument against him is, I guess, we didn't do very well, and so we need a change. I mean, we have our policy disagreements with McConnell. He's an appropriator, too big a spender by my lights, but I think he's been by and large pretty effective as a leader, particularly when he helped create the opening, put the block on Merrick Garland, Supreme Court nominee, that led to, I think, a crucial seat remaining open for the election in 2016 that helped Donald Trump win the election. I don't think he would have won without that. And of course, Trump was able to remake the majority on the Supreme Court. The nightmare scenario, I guess, with the Senate for Republicans, conservatives, Kyle, would be if something happened to one of the Supreme Court justices in the next 2 years. That would mean that we can get another liberal justice on the court.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an argument that McConnell should have been making or could have been making as they were trying to get candidates in these races that could win. I mean, the argument that he needs to go because the failures of this election strikes me as pretty disingenuous, given that a lot of these were not candidates that he chose. They were candidates that President Trump chose. And Mitch McConnell raised tens of millions of dollars to help try to get them over the finish line. And in one case, I think that made the difference. That'd be J.D. Vance in Ohio. The bright news on the Senate, though, I think for Republicans is that in 2 years, it looks like a pretty good map. There are 23 Democratic seats up in 2024 to 10 Republican seats. And it looks like some pretty vulnerable Democrats. You have John Tester in Montana, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, and not really any obviously vulnerable Republicans. I mean, Ted Cruz in Texas, Rick Scott in Florida. If Florida keeps trending the way it did on Tuesday, with the huge blowout victory by Governor Ron DeSantis, it looks like Rick Scott will probably be okay for maybe the next leadership challenge, the next leadership election. But that's the bright news for the Senate, I think, is if the Supreme Court stays the way it is for 2 years, it looks pretty likely Republicans can pick it up again.
Yeah, that map does look good in 2024 for Republicans. However, if there's essentially inter-party warfare over Donald Trump's candidacy and the Republicans lose in a rout in 2024, which is entirely possible, given the confluence of forces now, that Senate map could quickly turn into a lot less beneficial than it looks. All right, Kim, Kyle, thanks to you both. Thanks you all for listening. Tomorrow, we'll be back with another edition of Potomac Watch on the day that Donald Trump's hinting that he is going to announce his 2024 presidential campaign. Thank you for listening. We'll be back all the rest of the week with more editions of Potomac Watch.